But don't forget Wednesday night we're going to be still in the book of Revelations. We have not even begun to scratch the surface of that book. So y'all please join us Wednesday night starting at 6 o'clock. I'm going to tell a funny on Miss Faye. Wednesday, I ain't told my wife this. Wednesday, I think it was Wednesday or Thursday. It might have been Thursday. I was going through Walmart parking lot, and I seen Miss Faye and Miss Maydane and the other lady. She works, who? Annie. She works at Super Value, and I aggravate the stew out of her. And I seen them coming across the parking lot, and I thought, I'm fixing to fix them up. And I rolled my window down, and as loud as I could scream, I said, "Hey!" I said, "Are y'all out hunting men today?" And every one of them looked and thought, "Who is that?" And they all turned, and they just horse laughed, and they laughed. So, I thought I ain't going to let this opportunity pass me by. But, all right, in the book of Acts, I'm not going to ask you to stand. We got some visitors here. Make them feel welcome. Now, I know them personally. Good folks. Love them to death. I've known them for, wow, I don't want to say because I'll tell my age. Acts chapter 5. Acts chapter 5. We are now starting in the book of Acts, chapter 5. The church is now, we have seen sort of a perfect type church. A perfect type church in Acts chapter, up until about Acts chapter 4, everything's going great. Multitudes have been added. Thousands of people have been added. The gospel is still primarily a Jewish gospel. It is primarily still contained in Jerusalem. Just like with the gospel that we studied about today with Jesus Christ, the gospel was contained to Jerusalem. But in the next few chapters, the Saul, which we know him as Paul, is going to persecute the church, and the Christians are going to be scattered abroad, and that is how the gospel is going to be sent. Just like in the book of Revelations, during the 7-year tribulation, 144,000 Jews are going to be persecuted, and they're going to be sent, and the gospel is going to be spread in the book of Revelations during that time. But just like in Acts chapter 5, we see the sin of Ananias and Sapphira, and as I was reading this, and when you're studying the church, the early church, first century church, and I think it's important for us as Christians to know our history as church. In school, I know kids study Alabama history and they study U.S. and world history. And I think it's important that we know our history as Christians and know our history as a church, and where we came from, how we started, why are we here now. So I think it's important that we as Christians know our history. And studying this history of the church, when you get to Acts chapter 5, you kind of see the church start kind of stumble. There's a stumble in there with Ananias and Sapphira, and we learn that the key culprit in this is going to be Satan, because you remember that Peter addresses both of them, says, "Why has Satan filled your heart?" And just like in the Garden of Eden, Satan tried to mess up that plan, and just like in the book and with Moses, and just like with King Herod, Satan is always interfering with the gospel, with Christ, with salvation, all of it. And as I was studying this, I remember going to birthday parties as a kid, and they probably still have them, these candles that you would light and you would blow them out and they'd come back, you'd blow them out and they'd come back. That is just like the church and Christianity and the gospel. Satan is always trying to blow out that candle, but it always comes back and it always stays lit. Jesus Christ says, "I am the light," and you're not going to blow it out, I promise. It might be dim sometimes, but just like it tells us in the Gospels, we are not to hide it under a basket. It is supposed to shine. And that is what this church is supposed to do as Christians. We are supposed to be a light for the world. And when people drive by this church and they see us, we are supposed to be a light for that lost and dying world. So just like in the early church, the first church, it is a candle that has been lit, and it is a roaring bonfire. It is a massive fire, and Satan tries to come along and blow it out. And he does this in Acts chapter 5 with the sin of Ananias and Sapphira. But you'll notice that this candle is going to be relit. It is going to not go out. It is going to be lit again, and it is going to even be more brighter than before. And we studied last week in Acts chapter 5, 1 through 10 about that sin and how Peter approaches them. They sell some land. They get this idea from Barnabas. They sell some land. They keep back some of the profit, and they approach the husband. He says, "We gave it all to the church," and then he dies. And then Peter approaches the wife. "We gave it all to the church," and she dies. So when Satan tries to blow out this candle, God comes along and relights it. And then we see in verse 11 in Acts chapter 5, and when we study the book of Acts, you have to keep this in mind. This is true history. This is not make-believe. This is how we started as a church. This is our roots. This is how we started. And it says in verse 11, and a great fear because of what had happened. If you're in this church and you see two people drop dead because of a sin of lying, holding back from God, not giving to God what is rightfully His, it says, and a great fear came upon all the church. That is the first time really that word is going to be used. Jesus tells Peter, I'm going to build my church on you. You're going to be the rock. I'm going to build this church. And you see this starting in Acts chapter 5, this coming to fruition of how Peter is going to be kind of the standout guy in this. And if you study the book of Acts, the first portion of the book of Acts is all about the Apostle Peter and his role in Pentecost. And then the second part of the book of Acts is going to be with the Apostle Paul. So we have Peter, and he is primarily to the Jews. And then we have the Apostle Paul. He comes in. He's going to be primarily to the Gentiles. So you see how those two kind of come hand in hand. And it says, and a great fear came upon all the church. Now this is the group of people that is in Jerusalem. It is still contained in this. And Satan hopes, and I believe his desires at that time was to keep that contained in the walls of Jerusalem, not to let it spread. And upon as many as heard these things. Now let's go to verse 12. And you'll see how once you have a persecution, the church is going to rise up and it is going to be stronger than before. This church now, this very young church, still very young, is starting to be persecuted from within. And I said this once from here. You'll notice that when the persecution came, or the sin came to this church, it was not from an outside force. It was from an inside. The church is never going to experience sin from the outside. It always experiences sin from the inside, just like with the church of Corinth. That's what the 1st and 2nd Corinthians is all about. Paul writes the church of Corinthians, and he notices that they've got sin inside their church, and he approaches and he addresses that sin. So just like in verse 12, we see how, when we get to verse 12, we see how Satan tried to bring the church down. And it is always with the desires of the flesh and what is pleasing to the eye. It is always, and I'm not against money, please. It is, and we say that money's evil. No, it is the love of money. All right, let's keep that in perspective. Just like in the Garden of Eden, the Satan tempted, or the serpent tempted Eve. It was with the flesh. It was with eyes, with what you desire. And with Ananias and Sapphira, it comes with money, and it comes with possessions. And he tempted them with that, and they fell into the trap. Now, were these unsaved people? I'm not saying that they were unsaved. I believe that they were followers. I really do. They had joined this church, and they were in this massive movement. And just like with you and I, we are not immune to Satan. We're not. We are told to flee Satan. We are told to fight Satan with Scripture. But we are not immune to him. I know a lot of Christians who have fallen traps, have fallen into his traps, and it takes them a long time to recover. And it says, and by the hands of the apostles, and we talked about this today, about the works and the miracles of Jesus Christ that He manifests, and it points to Him being Savior. And it says, and by the hands of the apostles, the same miracles that Jesus Christ gave to these guys some 3.5 years prior to this is the same power that is working in them today. You remember, if you study the 4 Gospels, Jesus Christ gives these guys all of these powers to perform these miracles. They're actually found mostly in Mark and also in Luke. And you rarely see them or rarely hear about them performing any miracles in the Gospels. It's always Jesus Christ. But when you come to the book of Acts chapter 5, you see the miracles once again being ramped up. Because it tells us in verse 12, and by the hands of the apostles, they are no longer disciples. They are apostles, which means sent ones. And it says, and by the hands of the apostles were many signs and wonders wrought among the people that were inside the church. Not on the outside, but on the inside. And it says, and they were all with one accord in Solomon's porch. So this is taking place in Herod's temple, in the great temple. So we have these people that are in the Mecca of religion, which is Jerusalem. And they are at the headquarters, which is Herod's temple. And they are on Solomon's porch, which kind of surrounds that whole temple. And you could kind of go walk around all of Solomon's porch and kind of look down on the temple grounds. And it says, and they were all in one accord. They had one mind, they had one heart, they had one spirit. Everything was tunnel vision on Jesus Christ, everything was tunnel vision on the gospel. And they were one. They were not separate. They were one. And it tells us in verse 13, now imagine what you have just seen if you were in this first church. You've just seen people that you have probably known, people that has broken bread with you, and you have broken bread with them. You have discussed scriptures. You have prayed together, because it tells us at the beginning of the book of Acts is that they were a praying church. They were a Bible-believing church. So you have these people like Ananias and Sapphira that you would know, that you would sit beside on your church pew. And all of a sudden, they are dead. That is serious. And the rest durst no man join himself to them, but the people magnifying them. Jesus Christ and the gospel separates people. It does. And we've said this once, the gospel and God separates everything. God separates time. You have AD and you have BC. God separates families. The gospel separates friendships. The gospel can separate marriages. The gospel can separate churches. And that is what is happening now. The gospel is now being magnified, and when people see what it really means to be a follower of Christ, how serious it is and how serious God is with making you a follower if you do not go by His plans, and if you try to go against this new movement, guess what happens? You die. Is that an organization or a type of church that we would want to join? Would we want to walk down the aisle and say, I'd like to be a member of this church? That is how serious God takes His church. That is how serious God takes His bride. He wants her, and she will remain spotless. And it says, and the rest durst no man join himself to them, but the people magnified them. And look at what we look at in verse 14. We talked about this today. It is all about belief in the gospel. They are called believers. They are yet to be called Christians. They are called believers. And it says, and the believers, now imagine this. They've not one time went out and handed out tracts or said, hey, come to this church. This is all because of the power of God. This is what is happening. And you remember that verse, and I'm paraphrasing, it says, and God added to the church. God added to the church. So they've already got thousands of people that are joining this church, this movement. And it had to have thousands of people in order for the gospel to be spread. You would not have been able to do this with just a handful of people. Thousands would have had to join this church, and when Paul comes and he starts persecuting that thousands, they leave. And it tells us in the believers, Christians, followers of Christ, the believers were the more added to the Lord, multitudes. And if we look in Luke chapter 12, that word has always, for some reason, interested me. Because when you're dealing with Jesus Christ, you're always going to have a multitude of people in His ministry following Him. And I've referred to this verse a number of times. In Luke chapter 12, verse 1. Luke chapter 12, verse 1. This is the ending of His ministry. It says, in the meantime, when there were gathered together innumerable multitudes of people. Luke says there were so many people following Christ at the time that we could not even number them. That is hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people following Christ, because He is on His way at this time in Luke chapter 12 to Jerusalem for Passover. And every Jew that could take a breath of life and that could walk was going to Passover. So they were following Christ. So you've got hundreds of thousands of these multitudes of people that are following Christ. By the time you get to the cross, where are they at? They're gone. And so we see now that there is a different multitude of people that are following Jesus Christ and are following the gospel. They have a different focus. The focus on that multitude that you find in Luke chapter 12, they were interested in Christ because of the things that He could give them. The food and the fish and the water and healing their sick. They were not interested in the gospel. They were not interested in salvation or regeneration, all those big words. They were not interested in that. They just kind of looked at Jesus as a magician, something that could do a few magic tricks. We like you, just don't preach to us, just give us what we want. This is a different multitude of people. At the end of His ministry, we see these fickle people, these multitude of people, they are not followers. They are fake. They are non-disciples. But when we see the beginning of the church, we see this multitude. These are true Christians. These are people who are believers. And God is going to add Lord added multitudes. That is thousands and thousands of more people, both men and women. So we have this church at Jerusalem that has got thousands of people that are joined. Tens of thousands of people have joined this church. They started with 120, and now look what God has done for them. Now in verse 15, insomuch that they brought forth the sick into the streets and laid them on beds and couches. Kind of sounds familiar with what they done with Jesus Christ at the beginning of His ministry, didn't He? Remember when Jesus Christ said, well, we talked about this today, you're going to do greater works than me. Look how these works are now starting to manifest. Jesus Christ heals millions of people on His earthly ministry. And now we have these disciples that are carrying on the work of Christ. And we see that they are healing them. It says in the streets, they laid them on their beds and their couches. What's amazing to me about the Apostle Peter, early in his ministry, or early as being a disciple of Christ, he was quick-spoken. He didn't watch his tongue. He lacked faith. Remember when he was going to walk on the water and he started to sink when he looked at the waves and the storm? He actually told Jesus, quit talking about your death. We don't want to hear about your death. We don't want to hear about the resurrection. And we see Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane take out his sword and cut off the ear of Malchus. And we see how he was. But now when we look at the book of Acts, you can see the progression of him. You can see the progression of him as a Christian. Because it tells us that at the least, the shadow, just the shadow of Peter, passing by might overshadow some of them. Just by his shadow, under Apostle Peter, through Jesus Christ, people were healed. Do you see how all of this is starting to manifest itself? And we come out of this in Acts chapter 5 with this sin of Ananias and Sapphira, Satan trying to bring down the church, and all of a sudden God moves back in, and God starts adding to the church. They start having signs and wonders, and the people start people start coming in from the street, and they're laying on the couches, and they're sick, and Peter passes by them that even though his shadow might come upon them. And then it tells us in verse 16, there came also a multitude. That is not the multitude that we looked at now. In verse 14, this is another multitude. So you see when God starts doing something, how it is ramped up. And with the church being new, He knew that it was going to get persecuted in just a few months or a couple of years. So God is having to ramp this church up to get as many believers and as many Christians inside of that church so the gospel can be spread. So here's a different type of multitude. There came also a multitude out of the cities round about into Jerusalem. Guess what? You see the gospel starting to spread, don't you? How it is attracting people. What Jerusalem was at that time with the gospel, it was actually a big magnet, and it was bringing people to Christ. That is what our church is supposed to be, a big magnet bringing people to Christ. Every church around is supposed to be a magnet drawing people to Christ. And how is they draw to Christ? By our lives, how we live, being kind to folks, loving people. And it says, and out of the cities round about Jerusalem, bringing forth sick folk and them that were vexed with unclean spirits. And they were healed, every one of them. You didn't see them going out and spreading the gospel. The gospel was brought to these people, and it drew them to this church. And so you're having tens of thousands of people being drawn to this early church. And we have that great news in verses 12 through 16, and everything seems great. It would be an amazing to end that chapter right there. But as soon as this church starts making progression, and as soon as people start coming to the Lord and start becoming Christians and start becoming followers and taking up the cross and what Jesus Christ says, Satan is once again going to move in. And he does not move in from outside. It is always on the inside. And if you were living in Jerusalem that day, the one that was on the inside the most was the high priest. And the high priest at that time was a man by the name of Caiaphas. He is the same one that Jesus Christ stood for. He is the son-in-law of Annas, who was the former high priest. Caiaphas had married his daughter. So now we have Caiaphas, the high priest. And it says, then the high priest rose up. Now comes to persecution. He was high priest from about 27 to 36 AD. And it says, and then the high priest rose up, and all that were with him, that is all the Sanhedrins, and they were filled to the top, all the way. Their cup is runneth over. They are filled with indignation. I looked that word up in the Greek, and it means boiling hot water. It means the temperature it takes to boil water. They are hot. They're mad, they're fed up with it, and they're sick of it. They have tried to stomp out this Christianity. They have tried to stomp out this movement, and it is not working. So the high priest comes along with his Sadducees, and they are going to do something about it. So now you see, once again, how Satan is going to move in on this church. And they laid their hands on them, and the apostles, and they laid their hands on them, on the apostles, and put them in the common, that is a general public, in a prison. The one thing about the Sadducees is they did not believe in two things. They did not believe in angels, and they did not believe in the resurrection. Do you know what the main message of Peter was at Pentecost? Resurrection. They didn't like it. And I think it's fitting that God sends an angel to release these people. And it says, and the angel of the Lord by night openeth the prison doors, just like with Paul and Silas, the prison doors, and brought them forth. And this is what it's going to say. He does not say, go home, tuck tail and run, forget all about it. Your lives are in danger. You do not need to do this. This is what he says, and this is what Jesus Christ, almost the exact same words that Jesus Christ is going to tell his disciples before he ascends into heaven. And that word is what? Go. He says, go, stand, and speak in the lion's den. Guess where the Sadducees and the high priest, their officers were at? They were in the temple. He is going to put them right into battle. He is going to put them right in the lion's den. He does not say go out into the streets. He says take the gospel to the church. And I heard somebody once say that if the disciples and the Apostle Paul could come back and preach the gospel, do you know where they would preach it out? Outside the doors of most of our churches. Because not a lot of gospel is being preached from pulpits. So he tells them that where the gospel needs to be at is inside of the church or inside of that temple. So he tells them, he says, go, stand, speak in the temple to the people all the words of what? This life. There is either people that are going to life or there are people that are going to death. It's always two, isn't it? What is that life that they are talking about? Christian life, eternal life. It amazes me that they were set free to preach the coming of Christ. They was not set free to run and to hide. And it's amazing to me. These apostles that we're talking about are the same apostles that when the Roman guards came when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, guess what they done? They run and hid. And now they're going to be bold enough to go and stand right in the temple where Caiaphas is at, and all the Sadducees are at, and all of the Pharisees, and all the scribes, and all the elders, and they are going to hear again the gospel. Do you see how the gospel keeps going to these people and keeps going to the Jews? That is why Paul is going to come and let the gospel go to the Gentiles. But for right now, that gospel is still primarily to the Hebrews. He says, go to the temple. Guess what you could not do if you were a Gentile? You had the court of the Gentiles, you could get that far, but you could not go any further. He tells them, go take this gospel to the temple. Go take it to the Hebrews. Go take it to the Jews. This is what they done. And I'm fixing to finish. And when they heard that, they entered into the temple. They're bold, aren't they? You don't have them anymore hiding in the upper room after Jesus Christ gets arrested. They're bold. It says, and when they entered into the temple early in the morning and taught. It sounds great now, doesn't it? But there that word again is, B-U-T, but. And this is very cliche, and it's an old saying, but it is very true. When you're doing something for God, and when you're doing something for Christ, there is one person that is not going to leave you alone. You know who it is? He's never going to leave you alone. If he's not bothering you, chances are you're not doing anything because you're not a threat to him. But if you're doing something for God, he is going to come along and he's going to try to stop it. These apostles and these multitudes are doing something for God and they're doing something for Christ and they're spreading the gospel. But then we have, but the high priest came, that they were with him and called the council together, the 71, the Sanhedrins, all the Senate of the children of Israel and sent to the prison to have them brought. But, it's almost like checkmate, isn't it? But when the officers came and found them not in the prison, they returned and told. Isn't it neat that the only people that has ever escaped prison, really escaped, was the persecuted Christians in the first century? And it was always an angel coming and opening the door. You know, Satan wants to keep that gospel bound up in that prison, doesn't he? Doesn't want it to leave, doesn't want it to leave that four walls. If he can get them apostles, if he can get them the disciples in that prison, and they're going to be and if they are tried by the high priest and they are tried by the Sanhedrin, which did not have, they could not pass a death penalty, but they could bring it up before Caesar and before the Council of Rome. Maybe they could be killed. But God is not going to let the gospel die in a prison. He's going to let them go and He's going to set them free. And this is what they tell them, and I'm fixing to close. The prison truly found we shut with all safety, and the keeper standing without before the doors. But when we had opened it, we found no man within. It's amazing how this first century church progressed, isn't it? It's amazing how we have this young church, starts off with 120 people. And now it is progressing, it is spreading the gospel, but with that progression comes persecution. They've already been brought and they've already been told one time, don't ever teach His name again. Don't say anything else about Jesus. Don't say anything else about the resurrection. They go and they start spreading the gospel again. Satan moves in with Ananias and Sapphira. That doesn't stop it. And now they are preaching the gospel and they get locked up. They get loose and they say, go back to the temple. And it's always throughout the book of Acts. This is the gamut it's going to run. That's been 2,000 years ago. Guess what? A true church is still going to be persecuted. But the sad majority of it is going to be persecuted from within. While we sing just one verse of invitation. I know last week we met in the altar to pray for our church here. But as you pray quietly tonight within your heart or out loud, let's not only pray for our church here at Friendship, but let's pray for our brother churches. The churches that surround us, that they'll preach the gospel. And that they'll go out and they'll tell lost men and women, boys and girls, about Jesus.